Welcome back, horror fans, cinephiles, and Giallo enthusiasts. It's Tanner Leeser, your host for The King in Giallo. This is episode 5 of the Forgotten Giallo film series, 1966, and I've got 2 Gialli I'd like to highlight. As always, thanks in no small part to Troy Howard's book on Giallo cinema, So Deadly, So Perverse, 50 Years of Italian Giallo Films, Volume 1, 1963 to 1973. Like this video and subscribe to The King in Giallo, and do ring that notification bell so the lords of the algorithm may bestow their blessing upon me, and you continue to be presented with weekly Giallo content. This all helps me build my brand here as I fight to get to 1,000 subscribers and get one step closer to monetization here on YouTube. On to the video. The Forgotten Giallo films for 1966 will spotlight 2 films. The first Giallo showcase for 1966 is Ha Kome Azino, A for Assassin, directed by Angelo Dorigo, written by Sergio Bazzini and Roberto Natale, and based upon a play by Ernesto Gastaldi, music by Aldo Pija. It stars Sergio Ciani, billed as Alan Steele as Giacomo, Mary Arden as Angela, Ivano Davoli as Armando, Aisha Nana as Ariana, Charlie Carun as Julien, and Giovanna Gialetti as Zia Marta. The plot is about a collective of prospective heirs gathering at the old castle of their recently deceased, wealthy, yet cruel uncle in order to hear the readings of his will. The dead man, knowing that his family will likely off each other in order to get to his inheritance, puts forward a stipulation stating that they must all live in his castle for a single month, and the final 3 individuals will split the inheritance 3 ways. As predicted, the potential inheritors begin one by one to die off. In Ernesto Gastaldi's own words, quote, "My play, Ha Kome Azino, was staged for the first time by a good theater company led by Silvio Spacchesi in 1960. I sold the drama to director Angelo Dorigo through Walter Brandi, producer, and he assigned someone else to write the script, which was almost identical to my play," end quote. Technically speaking, the stage play by Gastaldi beat The Girl Who Knew Too Much, 1963, to the punch by 3 years. But this is Giallo cinema we're talking about here, not plays. Gastaldi's script owes a lot to the writing style of Agatha Christie, but with the several Giallo films released after The Girl Who Knew Too Much up to this film, the writing tropes seen here seem a bit antiquated. The setup isn't entirely original, however Gastaldi shows he's having fun from beat to beat. The greedy company of cast members here precipitates the unlikable cast trope found in the later Gialli from Mario Bava, and eventually slasher films, with Giallo examples of this including Five Dolls for an August Moon, 1970, and Twitch of the Death Nerve, 1971, or Bay of Blood. The setup is indicative of Agatha Christie, the characters of later slashers, and the location, a castle, reminisces on the tradition of Gothic horror, beautifully shot in black and white with Aldo Tonti's cinematography. Tonti worked previously with Federico Fellini on Nights of Cabiria, 1957, and Mario Monicelli on Casanova 70, 1965, and would later work with John Huston on Reflections in a Golden Eye, 1967, where he provided the images in golden hues, demonstrating that working on a black and white production should be no problem for the seasoned veteran. Director Angelo Dorigo proves himself. He keeps the film moving forward at a decent pace. He allows the material and the themes ample time to breathe and take flight, and doesn't try too hard to impose his own personality. Granted, the film does feel like it is a stage play, and that's not a bad thing. It is, essentially. The film is described by Howarth as still being worth your time. At this time, it seems unknown if Angelo Dorigo is still alive. But if he is well over 100 years old. He made one other Giallo film, 1967's The Killer Without a Face, next episode. The one who bought the script from Gastaldi, producer Walter Brandi, was born in 1928 and entered films in the early 1950s as an actor. His first role was a small part in Cose de Pazzi, 1954, by G.W. Pabst, which, fun fact, was photographed by Mario Bava. In the 1960s, he appeared in more Italian horror films, playing both heroic and villainous roles. The Vampire and the Ballerina, 1960. The Playgirls and the Vampire, 1960. Slaughter of the Vampires, 1962. The Bloody Pit of Horror, 1965. And Terror Creatures from the Grave, 1965. He transitioned from actor to producer in 1965 and remained working in this capacity until the 1990s. He died in 1996. Sergio Chani leads the cast, billed as Alan Steele. Born in 1935 and entering into films in the late 1950s, his muscular physique made him an ideal casting choice for the popular sword and sandal flicks, or pepla. He doubled for Steve Reeves in 1958's Hercules and Hercules Unchained, 1959. Sergio rose to star in some pepla: Samson, 1961, Samson and the Slave Queen, 1963, and Hercules and the Black Pirates, 1964, plus numerous others. This is his only Giallo appearance, and this film showcases that he had a very limited acting range, unfortunately, being described by Howarth as, quote, a dull and rather listless presence and seeming at a loss without cardboard boulders to hurl around. After Pepla and this one Giallo, he would find his way into the spaghetti westerns. His acting career slowed down by 1979. Mary Arden is the other standout performer in the picture, and she is wonderful as the deceased man's niece, and her character may not actually be as nice and caring as she lets on. Arden was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1933 and began as a model. Modeling took her to Europe, then Italy, where she appeared in a plethora of films from comedies by Franco and Ciccio, such as To Escape from Sing Sing, 1964, directed by Lucio Fulci, to Blood and Black Lace, 1964, by Mario Bava, where she played Peggy. You remember, she got slapped a lot. She quit acting in the 1970s and went from working jobs in marketing and managing for a fashion company in South America. Can you say Sangre y Encaje Negro? Then returned to the US, where she started her own marketing firm. I have found A for Assassin on DVD, but you may also find it streaming online in its entirety if you are interested. On to the final film for 1966, The Murder Clinic, an Italian and French production also called Revenge of the Living Dead, directed by Leonello De Felice and Elio Scardamaglia, billed as Michael Hamilton. With a screenplay by, who else at this time, Ernesto Gastaldi, billed as Julian Barry, and Luciano Martino, billed as Martin Hardy. Music composed by Francesco De Masi, billed as Frank Mason. The cast consists of William Berger as Dr. Robert Vance, Francois Prévost as Gisela, Mary Young as Elizabeth Vance, Barbara Wilson as Mary, Harriet White Midden as Sheena, and Massimo Rigi, billed as Max Dean, as Fred. The plot takes place in an isolated mental hospital in Norfolk in 1870, where beautiful young women are being killed off by a psychopath wielding a razor blade. The main suspect is Dr. Vance, as he has been having affairs with several of the victims, while his wife, Lisbeth, recovers from a heart ailment. Gisela, newly arrived at the hospital after running away from her guardian, sees Dr. Vance disposing of incriminating evidence. She pretends to be ill so she can sneak in, where she eventually blackmails the doctor. The film was adapted by Ernesto Gastaldi from a book entitled The Knife in the Body, supposedly written by Robert Williams. Gastaldi says the book was actually penned by Leonello De Felice. The film walks the tightrope between giallo and gothic horror, similar to Mario Bava's The Whip and the Body, 1963, but whereas that film only played around with the giallo trappings, this one here is way more steeped in the tropes. The film also takes from Eyes Without a Face, 1960, by Georges Franju. A portion of the original script deals with Dr. Vance being guilt-ridden over botching a surgery and disfiguring his sister-in-law, and then his attempts to find a skin grafting technique to restore her once again to her former beauty. This plot point is not emphasized in the film, but it goes to show the inspiration nonetheless. The film spends a lot of time focusing on characters skulking about dark and dreary corridors, just offering themselves up to be killed next. Dr. Vance is too hyped up in the film for the seasoned Giallo veteran to assume he must actually be the killer, and the actual killer is said to be rather predictable. But Howarth points out that while Gastaldi may have given Dario Argento shit for his killer reveals to lack any logic and come out of nowhere, which, honestly, they kind of do for the most part, except for Opera. I digress. This same criticism cannot be said about the gialli written by Gastaldi, which oftentimes spell it all out too clearly. The film unfortunately lacks a healthy dose of characterization, and the characters are interchangeable for the most part. There is an abundance of obvious red herrings, and the pacing is more turtle than hare, but the shocks are executed well enough. Elio Scardamaglia, producer-director, was born in 1920 and worked extensively as a producer on films such as The Whip and the Body, 1960 by Bava, Johnny Hamlet, 1968 by Enzo G. Castellari, The Clowns, 1970 by Federico Fellini, with The Murder Clinic being his one and only directing credit. Elio seems better at individual scenes than directing the film as a whole, and numerous of the scenes with the killer are handled very well as they stalk about, but there seems to be an equal balance of static scenes meant to nudge the plot forward. This balancing issue is attempted at being remedied by the cinematographer and the composer, Marcello Masciocchi and Francesco De Masi, and their attempts are appreciated, but they do not solve the issue. Ernesto Gastaldi claims that the film was actually directed not by Scardamaglia, but by the author, Leonello De Felice, but he abandoned the production during the final stages, prompting Scardamaglia to take over. De Felice was born in 1916 in Naples, and he worked in films working on the production side of things in the late 1930s, gradually working his way up. He found his way to assistant director, and his first credit was on La Corona di Ferro, 1941, directed by Alessandro Blasetti. Then he wrote Blasetti's Fabiola, 1949, plus some others. He began directing in 1951. By the time The Murder Clinic was in production, he was pretty much done with directing, not to mention that his bad experiences on this film, with receiving no credit for his contributions here, was indicative of prior experiences he had had since his last official directing credit with 1961's Constantine and the Cross. De Felice continued screenwriting until the late 1970s, then retired, before passing away in 1989. William Berger, born in 1928 in Austria, made his way to America and made appearances on Broadway and television before heading back to Europe. He did several spaghetti westerns including Face to Face, 1967, and Today We Kill, Tomorrow We Die, 1968, but was also in a few gialli, including Mario Bava's $5 for an August Moon, 1970, and Tonino Valeri's My Dear Killer, 1972. In 1970, Berger and his wife were thrown in jail on drug charges, and though Berger was eventually released, his wife died due to medical complications during her incarceration. He continued to act until his death in 1993. The supporting cast includes American Harriet White Midden, who had worked as a dialogue coach on films for John Huston, Joseph Losey, Roberto Rossellini, and Mario Bava. She does a great job as the shifty housekeeper, plus she was able to dub her own performance into English. She played Clarissa in Blood and Black Lace. Massimo Ricci was Marco in Blood and Black Lace. The setting of the film, The Asylum, would be reused in Fernando de Leo's Slaughter Hotel, 1971, and was already used in 1962 in Ricardo Frida's The Terror of Dr. Hitchcock. The Murder Clinic is also available on DVD, as well as can be found streaming online in its entirety. And those are the forgotten giallo films of 1966. I hope you learned something new. If you are interested in watching these movies, go ahead and look them up online. If you do watch them or have already seen them, I invite you to leave your thoughts on them in the comments. Follow The King in Giallo on Instagram and give a like to The King in Giallo on Facebook. Subscribe here on YouTube if you aren't already, and join me every week for new Giallo film content. Upcoming content on The King in Giallo will be episodes 6 and 7 of the Forgotten Giallo film series 1967 and 1968 Part 1, respectively. Then, the overview, review, and Gialitelli video for Giulio Chesti's 1968 Proto Giallo, Death Laid an Egg. Thank you very much for your continued support. This is Tanner Leeser for The King in Giallo, and if nothing else, I'll see you next time.
What have I done?
Don't worry about it.